Thanks, Chair. Just on the basis of enforcement, and you mentioned it there from the local authorities, enforcement on certain projects, once an enforcement notice has been given, there is a statutory time that you have to reply to an enforcement notice. And if you reply to a statutory notice from an enforcement, that gives you, once you open communications, it then goes to the local authority with enforcements. On cases where enforcements were sent out and somebody was late with coming back within that 10 days or whatever, an enforcement, and if the paperwork was correct, is there something in there that can actually stop the enforcement proceedings continuing? Because we had a case in Limerick recently that went on for 2.5 years over paperwork, got in on time but it wasn't registered on time, and what we found was it took 2.5 years with a lot of legal expenses to correct a case, and after 2.5 years it was struck out. But this was due to under the enforcement regulations that were there in place at the time. So anyone that is building outside of the regulations and there's enforcement proceedings ongoing and have been started, that's fine. But if the case is that enforcement proceedings are put in place and it didn't warrant enforcement proceedings, is there a way of getting through this and not delaying projects for a year and 2 years over something that was overlooked or something that was that came in and wasn't addressed at the time? And a lot of this is to do again with staffing from the local authorities. A lot of the staffing is not there to meet the demands of enforcement, and a lot of the enforcement then isn't carried through on time, and is causing issues, especially within the Limerick Authority ourselves. We have seen it. They need more staff. They need more people to deal with enforcement, but they also need to be able to follow it through. But in the case where paperwork isn't in the right place at the time, they also need to be able to stop the proceedings and see that they have an opt-out. So they are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Donoghue. I suppose maybe first off, you know, this particular amendment isn't addressing, it's not an enforcement, it's addressing substitute consent. But I mean, I can just give you, generally, the enforcement process is, it was reviewed a number of years ago. There is an obligation on local authorities to investigate when complaints are made, and there are steps that they must carry out, because obviously enforcement is a very serious process, and local authorities do not undertake it lightly. In terms of paperwork and, you know, delays, I suppose I can't comment on any individual cases, but I think it's probably clear to say that enforcement could have significant impacts on the recipient of the enforcement case. So I think, you know, local authorities would take that very seriously in ensuring that all the paperwork is in order. I can't comment in terms of the length of time it takes to process it in terms of court paperwork. Again, that would be a matter for the individual local authorities themselves. All I can say is that enforcement is an important part of the planning system, you know, I suppose maybe in terms of resourcing for local authorities, maybe it's not you know, maybe it's not a matter for this particular session. If it's something that you want to raise with us separately, more than happy to talk through. But in terms of this specific presentation today, I don't know if I can get into any more detail than that.
Hopefully,
Deputy, if that somehow addresses your question.
Thanks.